Hi, my name is Jasper van Putten. I'm a watercolorist, a cartoonist and art historian. This is the first video in a series of videos in which I will explain the system that I developed of making watercolor paintings with all kinds of knives instead of brushes. In this first introductory video, I'm just going to explain how I got the idea and why I'm painting with knives. In the following videos after this, I will go into more detail in what kinds of knives to use for what kind of effects and how to keep a steady paint flow to the tip of the knife and all kinds of details like that. So, how did I get the idea? Well, I got the idea of painting with knives from the famous Argentinian cartoonist Alberto Breccia. Breccia is a master and a very experimental cartoonist who in his comic Mort Cinder famously used knives, especially razor blades, to make his beautiful pen drawings or pen-like drawings, razor blade drawings. And the difference he explains in a YouTube video that I will link to in the notes between using pen and knife is that with these razor blades he uses them sometimes as a pen-like instrument to create very thin lines, but then in other places he effortlessly moves to broad strokes with the side of the blade, almost like using a palette knife as in oil painting. And the beauty of it is that with the razor blade he can move from one movement to the other and effortlessly go between the two. So, obviously in watercolor I use this differently, and that's what I will explain in my series of videos. So why do I use knives? Do I have anything against brushes? Of course not. I'm a watercolorist and I use brushes all the time, and as you see I have quite a few and I use them all. I will show you some uses of them in just I found that knives have just the same variety of forms and shapes, so almost the same. And I use all of these knives as well. And in the coming videos I will show you how to use them. So I will now briefly explain the advantage of knives over brushes in my way of working and why I actually use them. So I love to paint what's called wet in wet. So wet paint on a wet surface. So we first paint or apply water to the surface, make it evenly wet all over, or almost all over, with a broad brush. The entire paper is wet. What happens when we paint with a thin brush? Forms with some indigo. We are able to create quite beautiful forms, and they flow, the lines flow beautifully in the water. So that's great. And I actually love that and I use it quite often. But after a while you see that the forms flow into the water, and if you don't do anything they will keep blurring, and the forms will blur until the paper is dry, which not necessarily has to be a problem. But when you work longer on the paper, and especially if you add more water, the forms will be blurrier and blurrier, and it's really difficult to keep the inspiring, beautiful forms clear as they were when you first made them on the paper. So with careful planning, you'll be able to keep the forms you like and use them in your painting. But all of that careful planning kind of distracts from me from the very joy of working wet in wet and being able to create things as I go. I plan a lot, but I like the planning to be beforehand, and during the painting be free to do and to go over things without having to fear all the time that the beautiful forms that I painted will blur out and disappear. So what is the advantage of knives? So let's use the same wet surface for some knife painting. Add some light and show off the knife. So we dip the knife into the same ink. This is difficult and it's not the way I usually do it. I'll explain later how I do it, but it's quite possible to just dip your scalpel knife in the paint and then make these sharp lines. So because the surface was wet when I made the low incision, shallow incision, the incision will, the paint will flow out from the incision and work its way sideways, blur it, like with the brush strokes. But as you see, the forms, the lines, or blurred lines, stay much sharper than the ones I made with a brush stroke. And to be fair, we have to also paint over these a bit with water, because we did that with the other brush strokes as well. And you see, because the incision holds the ink, or sorry, the paint, it will remain there much longer than with the brush strokes. So that's a huge advantage, or one of the advantages, especially in my technique where I work with these wet in wet forms and like to work on a painting for a long time, so with the danger of those strokes that I made blurring out later, this is a huge advantage. What I'd like to do is show off some work with the same techniques as I just used. This is the dried up, or almost dried up, as you see, test sheet that I was just showing how to do. As you see, the forms above that I made with the brush have been submerged into some kind of blur, which can be useful, but it's hard to make works that are to your liking with entirely that technique. However, with the knife, you see the straight line is still highly visible, whereas the blur is also beautiful and interesting. So works that I made with these techniques, I'll show you here. This is you see a duck seen half underwater with these very sharp curved lines indicating border between the water surface and the air above. The blur is entirely due to the curved lines that have flown out, just as in my test sheet. These little feathers, or wet feathers of the duck are also made with knives. As you see, the sharp tiny lines here are all knife lines, and they have been submerged in forms around them, partly made with brush, of course, but the sharp lines are knife lines. The curved lines above were all made with this Fiskars brand rotary cutter. You don't actually cut through the paper, of course, but you make shallow incisions as I did with the scalpel. This comic character called Jurk that I made swimming underwater is the lines outlining the edges of his arms and fingers are knife lines, and they're pretty sharp, and I like that because I wanted to show the contrast between the blurred water without outlines and the form of the man underwater, which is sharper. I wanted to show that contrast. Then this huge burst of flames was also entirely made with knives, but with another type of knife, with this Stanley knife, and with these small parts of razor blades. I cut the razor blade up, as you see. I cut it in a quarter of a total blade because, as you see, the watercolor is not that big, and to work with larger knives like this for the entirety would be rather blunt. So a quarter of a razor blade works quite well to create these forms, which were all made wet in wet with this knife used almost like a palette knife. Obviously, when you're cutting up a knife itself, use a protective set of glasses to protect your eyes and protect your fingers with protective gloves. All the rest, such as these forms, were made with this knife here. I'm trying to get the edges even straighter, so I'm not that happy with this part here, which I will touch up a bit. But here, the sharpness actually works really well, and the lines here also work are to my liking, because they are sharp but not too dry, and everything is done with wet paint on a wet surface, so wet in wet, and I think it works really well for the flames. Okay, so I hope you enjoyed this, and I hope you'll check in with my further videos in which I explain more details of these techniques. See you next time.